So right here, I'd like to show you this chart that shows you the rent gap theory. Now, what is rent gap theory? It's the legend of gentrification. This chart, this theory was created in 1979, but after all these years, it still makes sense economically. And this is the idea essentially that if you build it, they're going to come. We often blame individual home buyers, hipsters, etc., for gentrification. And trust me, I'm not making a ton of money as a graduate student, and I'm feeling the pinch, the rent pinch, when I see wealthier people moving into a neighborhood that I'm living in and feeling that, seeing my rent go up. So I get it, but people who are putting their life savings into something like buying a home, they want that property to grow. They don't want it to lose value. It makes the most economic sense for them to be operating in this way that tends to sometimes push gentrification. So, and I see this happening as a renter. I've lived in gentrifying neighborhoods myself. But here, rather, as we can see from this chart, it's important rather to just focusing on the individual home buyers coming into neighborhoods, new gentrifiers coming in. It's also really important to focus and concentrate on large real estate holders, developers, banks, finance, insurance, real estate, the acronym, the FIRE people, right? Finance, insurance, real estate. So what happens in neighborhoods for one reason or other is that the value of properties in neighborhood and land goes down. That's disinvestment from neighborhoods. That happens periodically, and you can see that when you drive around a big city like Philadelphia. And so when the value dips to a certain point, we can see that where my mouse is at the bottom of the curve, it's now profitable for the owner of that building to either sell it to a developer or to develop it themselves and to get a potentially higher rent. So if you own like 12 buildings, there's not a whole lot of incentive for you to put much upkeep into these buildings unless you're getting a lot of rent for it. But if you're not getting a lot of rent for it, there's a sort of, this is a bottom to the real estate market. This is what a slumlord is. This is what sort of the market creation of slumlords. The market is telling people in some cases to be slumlords. Of course, there are crappy people out there, but we get a lot of slumlords not just because of people wanting to be crappy people to others, but because of the market giving people incentives to be slumlords. So the building might be rotting from water damage, for instance, but it just doesn't pay for the owner, especially if they've got a lot of buildings, to put capital into fixing it if the rent, if the renters are paying a low amount of rent. So if I were an owner, if I want to milk this property, you're going to have to keep giving me money because you have to live here and you're going to have old stuff that doesn't work too well. But when the value around the neighborhood gets high enough, well, as the owner, then I'm going to sell it to a developer and they're probably just going to come knock it down, and it's not going to be salvageable anymore, and they're going to build new construction. And you can see that all around Philly. You can see that in that previous video, in that picture from Point Breeze, for instance, that I showed you. So it's a great solution, right? The developer then builds it and they get higher rent from that new building. So the rent gap is this idea that the developer will hold a piece of real estate and you'll buy it cheaply, and then maybe you get some money back on rent. I mean, I don't see that as ethical, but it is a good way to stack dough. And because you aren't putting any improvements in, you're making a profit. That's a slumlord right there. And then when the neighborhood gets to a certain point, when the property values of the neighborhood start rising, you can see that reflected in the chart. When the property values start rising, that's the closing of the rent gap. People are interested in buying the property, maybe knocking it down and maybe rebuilding a nicer place and getting people who can pay more rent. Then you have this potential land rent. This is the highest and best use in terms of getting a profit. This rent gap is when the actual and potential are at their biggest gap. And that's when the owner of the property is going to be able to take action and make a big profit. So we look at this because we want to focus on the role of not just culture and race. Those are a part of it, but there's also finance, there's developers, and the government that holds this up through tax abatement. And a tax abatement is when new owners don't have to pay taxes for X number of years. And it's basically incentivizing people to buy in particular neighborhoods and to operate in this way that is closing the rent gap. So this is the tough part for you as you maybe finish college go out there and start thinking what you want to do, buying property maybe, and you want to be ethical about it. And so thinking ethically about housing sometimes is contrary and contradictory to what you want to do that makes the most economic sense, the most financial sense to you. And so, a lot of times we ultimately need to take care of ourselves in this system. It's important in that case to understand why the system is incentivizing us to do things that might go against our ethics. And in a lot of cases, it's more important to change the system than it is to kind of work individually against that system, because the individuals pushing against that maybe aren't really going to do much anyway. So the system is set up with this rent gap, and it creates and facilitates what we know as gentrification, essentially.